if you grew up in the environment under any denomination that says Jesus is God's son, he's the savior of the world, you are destined for eternal punishment unless you have him covering you. And you get the sense that every other religion is very deficient. You grow up with God as, Yahweh is God, the Bible is book, Jesus is his son, the gospel is what it's all about. And whether or not you address, if or when you ever address whether or not that's true or if it's mythology, as you're hearing that story, you're still hearing everything else being discounted. Buddhism might have some good things, but it's wrong. Same thing for Islam, every other religion. It's all wrong, and they would focus a lot on the gloriousness of the idea of grace. In other words, you could look at all these religions, and I've heard Robert Price talk about how there's actually a branch, I think, of Buddhism that's very similar to the idea of God's grace. But most religions, by and large, are not focused on grace. It's more like I do something, I bring enough of an offering to God, I do something good, I say enough prayers. It's either faith plus works, the traditional Roman Catholic perspective, or it's very much full works. And the idea of this is just free grace. You don't deserve anything. The only thing you bring to it is perhaps the willingness to admit you're completely depraved and in need of grace. You bow your knee and you can repent of your sins, but you don't, even that is a gift from God. For Ephesians 2:8-9, everything, even the faith to say, God, I need you, please redeem me. Even that, it feels like it's you doing it, but even that is God preemptively working in your heart, and especially from a Calvinistic perspective, which is what I came from.
Okay.
But when you grow up with this, the gloriousness of the gospel, the gloriousness of grace, the utter deficiencies of all the other religions, when you have that as your structure, as your absolute foundation, your worldview, and that falls apart, there is the implication, not saying this is rational or logical, but just there's the implication for people who have that if this was the top tier, everything else is so far lower, that the path from that to atheism does feel fairly clear, in the sense of, like when I deconverted, I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in saying, well, I've just debunked Christianity, maybe Islam's right, maybe Buddhism's got the path. It was an instant, like I couldn't go back to anything. And it's funny, I talk a lot with people about, why is Christianity mythology? Why is it not literally true? And as much as, like, if someone could theoretically debunk it and say, well, what you saw in John 21 is a rewrite of Pythagoras, with the 153 fish, or what you saw is a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey in Luke and Acts, we can debunk that and show you that's not true. And if they could theoretically start to just take every single step that I've taken and say, I can prove to you it's not what you thought it was, like, there's something that happens in your head, at least in my head, that says, I feel so incredibly duped that no matter what you tell me at this point, and I know we don't ever say never, but it just feels like there's something mythological that you get disgusted by, and you feel duped by, and you say, I couldn't go back to that no matter what you say. Not that I don't want to pursue the truth. I will pursue the truth, but I'm so disgusted by that. I know that's not true. I want truth, but I know that's not it. Yahweh's not God. There might be a God, but it's not Yahweh. And so for me, the path from deconversion to atheism was, a quarter of an inch long. It just, bam, if there's no if there's no Yahweh and there's no Jesus, there's no God. And I know you've addressed that as saying that's not necessarily the healthiest way to see it. And I just wanted to ask you to briefly kind of respond to that. And if we were friends that chatted every week and we were kind of talking through, if you had been part of my conversation at that point, what would you have added to the conversation to say, yeah, but there's more to that?
Well, if I were your friend and we were chatting regularly, I hope I'd mostly just listen to you and not try to tell you very much. Because, I really think that each of us has to figure this stuff out in our own way. And your background is, in spite of the overlaps with mine, still somewhat different. Mine was definitely not Calvinist. It was this, so-called Arminian opposition to Calvinism. Anyhow, that doesn't really matter. I think, though, on this question, it's not just about the healthiest way to think of it, although maybe that enters into it. I just think there are two different kinds of questions. That it's true. I relate to that. That when you've got it all packaged and you're in the church, and you hear relentlessly, well, in my background, if this isn't the inerrant word of God, then I don't know, nothing matters. Basically, when you're in the church, there's this view that you are whether the elect in a Calvinist sense or you're saved anyway, one way or another, and you're on the like Noah's Ark, and the rest of the world is just underwater, right?
Mm.
So you're not going to join them, and it's all just darkness and misery out there, and hell. It's all literally going to hell. So when you leave that, if that's a kind of, to use a common word nowadays, binary choice, well, you tried that, now you're going to try the other thing. The other thing is godlessness, all the stuff that the church has been railing against. I guess that's what I'm left with,
Mm-hmm.
So I fully get it. I fully get that this is the movement from one to the other seems like one package to another package deal, but only two packages on offer. I just think that, and I've been very fortunate that I stumbled into, university after that and took the life of a historian. So I can't see it that way anymore. I think that historical questions in general, and philosophical questions are just completely different. So, for example, some of the earliest critics of Christianity, like the philosopher Celsus in the 2nd century already, his writings are not preserved because only writings favorable to Christianity were preserved. But people who didn't like him, especially Origen, wrote 5 volumes against Celsus. That's how worked up he was about Celsus. And he quoted him in large chunks. So that's nice. And you can actually put all those chunks together and have a decent book. So we get the voice of Celsus, actually. And Celsus said, it's absurd. Your Christian ideas are just absurd. That the notion that the rest of the world will be burned up while you are rescued, you of all people, you ignorant, the fools, gullible people are rescued, and the rest of the world will fry like in a fry pan, a cook's fry pan. This is just crazy, and that's arrogant as well of you to think that. But Celsus was a Platonist philosopher. Well, it seems he was. There's some debate about that, but he was a philosopher who believed in ultimate reality, what you might call God, the first mover of some kind. So these are completely different questions. That's my point. They just are different questions. Whether one of us feels they are or not in our personal journey, we may associate, one thing with this and one thing with another. But in the general, history of Western thought, they are completely separate questions.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah,
and that's maybe more
same thing with Julian. Julian, the so-called apostate. This guy's fascinating. He was raised as a Christian. He knew the Bible inside out, as did Porphyry a century before him. Knew it intimately because he was raised with it. He actually, up until age 20, he was taking church offices. His uncle's Constantine, who had led the empire into accepting Christianity, and Constantius, his cousin, was a proud Christian. So the empire was Christian, but he turned his back on it. But he turned his back on it for Neoplatonism, which was still, he very much believed in gods and sacrifice and all of that kind of thing, even though he thought Christianity was ridiculous. I'm sorry, I cut off your interjection, but
no, that was good.
I wanted to add that.
Yeah, please, that's great. I could say I've got a lot of little questions I want to add to that, but I do want to leave time to get to some of the other questions, and so I'll table some of those questions, and maybe I'll come back before a follow-up interview and re-listen to where we left off and write down some of those extra questions.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to get to, you in one of the articles I read about you focused or you started with just the definition of the word history, pointing out that it's the word historia, which in Greek means research or inquiry. And in some of the things I've read of you, I think you've fleshed out the idea that people wrote stories differently in certain historical timeframes, and that if we take the approach that we would take today, which is for at least a lot of Christians, is very literal, that we're missing some of the points. And I wanted to ask kind of a couple of questions, and I'll put them all out there, and you can kind of merge them how you want to. The quick question, which I would love a yes or no to, is the story of Jesus mythology? Just yes or no? Is it legend? But in the bigger picture, you do get the sense that the New Testament writers are doing what the mystery cults did, which is to say, we have a mystery, we have a story, and the initiates, the people that are going to be baptized, into our mystery cult, who are going to have the ritual, meal with us, who are going to become have fictive kinship with us, that they get some of the secrets, and the outsiders don't get them. And thus, Mithraism is, we don't even know all that they believe because it was so secret, and they did such a good job of keeping it secret. And you get the sense of that in the Gospel. Jesus would say, he'd say to the apostles, or to the disciples, I'd say, I'll tell you this, but I'm going to tell them in parables. I don't want them to know the real story. And you get that over and over. And Paul talks about it's a mystery hidden from the creation of the world. It's a mystery hidden from before. But now I'm going to proclaim to you the mystery.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of this, and you get this sense that there's hidden meanings, especially when you start to bring in the numbers, the gematria, the numerology, the Pythagoras. You're like, well, what is Pythagoras and gematria? I may be mispronouncing the word, but what does that have to do with the Bible? Why are there these numbers? And you get into John and Revelation, the 144,000. You're like, all right, gematria is now on steroids. Pythagoras is all over that. It's like there's like do you remember the movie Contact, where they're listening to they're from Carl Sagan, they're listening to the radio waves where it's going boom, boom. But this guy that is blind, but he can hear really well, he starts cranking up the volume, and he's like, guys, there's a second wavelength here. And he cranks it so loud that everyone's like, holding their ears. It's so loud. It's just boom, 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 boom. And they suddenly hear it like boom, 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 boom. And it's like, and they zoom in, and it's actually like a video that's embedded in the audio. And you get this sense that that's possibly what's happening here, that people are seeing this, Jesus, he feeds the people, he walks on water, but there's this whole other story. And especially when, if you're the kind of person, and I admit my ignorance in some of this, but if you're the kind of person that could write the New Testament, meaning you've studied, Greek, you've studied the Plato and Homer, what kind of books people are looking at. They're looking at the Iliad, the Odyssey. They're looking at all these epics. They're looking at, they're very familiar with Dionysius. They're very familiar with, all that, and a lot of Egyptian stuff woven in. They know this stuff, and I get the sense that when the original writers, who were initiates and who were well educated, would have read the original New Testament, they would have this constant impact of, oh, I see what you did there. You're copying, you're correcting the Dionysius story. You're paralleling from this and that, and okay, that's periphery, and this is from the Bacchae, and they're correcting it, they're paralleling it, they're having the same structure, they're borrowing it, they're maybe telling the story the opposite way to fix it. Especially the Pythagoreans, they're not going to read John 21 and say, oh, it's exactly 153 fish. They're going to know that's our guy. But the outsiders wouldn't know that. And I get the sense that sometimes that's still going on. Like people they won't admit there is something else going on here. It's not necessarily like it's rocket science and no one can get it, but there's something going on here. And that it's almost like a psychological unwillingness to admit that. And if that's true, if you agree with that to some extent, what is going on with all of this? Is it mythology? And how are we to interpret these stories in a way that the original writers really meant for them to be taken for the initiates?
Yeah. Huh.
I know it's a lot quick, but.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked, as they say. Good questions. And I'm glad you filled in some context of what you're thinking. I've seen a couple of your podcasts before, or your interviews before, and I've gathered some. Yeah, I enjoyed them. I very much like your interviewing style. By the way, it's great for the interviewee. You really let us talk, and that's it can be dangerous, but it's also nice for getting out what we actually want to say. Unfiltered. So thank you for that.
Sure.
I say that because I've been a part of so many documentaries, not so many, but enough, where you give like a 3-hour interview and they use 2 minutes, and they actually often have you say things that you completely disagree with. It's not actually by nefarious close editing, but simply by juxtaposing one statement with another in a different context, it gives quite a different impression. So I very much like this format. And I'll respond in kind. I'm going to be very direct and say the Christ mythicist kind of approach that you've not fully described, but sort of encapsulated there. I wouldn't say it's wrong. I just would say that it doesn't do anything for me as a historian in my day-to-day work. It doesn't help me. And I'll try to tell you as clearly as possible why. Your premise was the story, the Jesus story, the story about Jesus. The problem for me as a historian of this stuff, in part, is that I don't see a story of Jesus anywhere. What I see are, right from the beginning, ferocious debates among different groups of Christ followers about who Jesus was and what his significance might be. So let me give you an example. Of course, as you know, the earliest Christian or Christ following texts that we have are Paul's letters. And they're the only pretty solid stuff from the first generation after Jesus, let's say hypothetical, if you like, Jesus' death. So if there was a guy named Jesus and he died under Pontius Pilate's rule from either 18 or 26 to 36 or 37 CE, then it was in that period, and Paul's writing clearly in the period from the 30s or around 40 to the mid 50s, 60, something like that. So it's the first generation of Christ followers, and his letters are the only things we have from that period. So forget about the Gospels for a while. Think about Paul's letters. He immediately finds himself in a great conflict with a whole bunch of different people, and they are quite different,
including Peter, even
including Peter and Jesus' own brother, James. And that's quite amazing. So Jesus' own brother says that Paul's, really full of it, and he and Peter to Cephas to some extent, they are kind of allied somehow, at least toward one side. So to keep things simple, I would say there are at least 3 streams that are really incompatible with each other, that are visible right from around the year 40 or so, and they're fiercely contested. So Paul already knows about a group that hung around Jesus and Jesus' brother, because he mentions them, Galatians 1 and 2, as those reputed to be held to be pillars, right? And I went and I don't care who they are. God tells me I talk to God. God tells me who's right and who isn't. I don't. Yeah, reputed to be pillars and blah blah. But I went up to see, not because I had to. I'm not going because they said, Paul, you come and see us. I don't recognize their authority. I deal with God directly, but God told me to go up. I went up by revelation. God told me to go see these people. Why? Well, in case everything I've been doing out here was in vain and it was all going to just blow up because they wouldn't accept it. And then he says, we worked out some kind of agreement. If I would stay with these non-Jews, that they don't care so much about that, as long as I sent some money back to them, because I'm dealing with richer people, wealthier, more comfortable people. But then Paul's thing in 1 Thessalonians, what he's saying about Jesus is really very minimalist. He says, I've got this announcement to make, evangelion in Greek, this announcement, which I got from God, and it's this: Christ died and rose for our sins. He's up in heaven. He's coming back soon, and you all need to be ready when he comes back. That's it. That's the sum because he said that to him. Then he left in Thessalonica, and he sent Timothy to go talk to them, make sure that they're still ready. And Timothy comes back with questions from them, and the questions are, how long do we have to wait for this to happen? And he said, keep loving one another. Like, really? Like, this is getting quite hard. And what about, we got somebody who's sick here. What about somebody who dies before it happens? Like, we're all geared up for this Jesus to come back. What if somebody dies? And those are the questions Paul answers in First Thessalonians. So that's his thing. That's Paul's thing in a nutshell. That's all he's really concerned about. But he's also Jewish, right? And he's claiming this about Christ. And some of Christ's other followers say, what are you talking about? Like, that this is all nonsense. That's not what following Christ means. First of all, you have to be Jewish, right? Jesus was a guy. He lived and walked around Nazareth. We knew him. We hung out with him. I'm his brother, by the way. You know, I should know what he was like. And, you know, he taught within the context of Jewish law. You can't understand my brother Jesus without understanding, you know, Jewish culture. So if you're going to follow him, well, you better follow Jewish law. You better, if you're male, you know, be circumcised, come and join the Jewish community, then you can follow what Jesus. So you've already got two completely different views there. One's for Gentiles who don't need to know anything about Judaism. One's completely Judaism is already a Christian construction, but Judean culture, Jewish law. And then, on the other hand, when he writes 1 Corinthians, he says, well, I've heard from, you know, Chloe's people, I've got some snitch there, that after I left you all, some other people came who were building on my foundation, some other Christ teachers. Anyone who builds on my foundation better be careful how he builds, because, you know, the day is coming when fire will be applied, and whatever you build is going to be burned up if it's not solid. And who's building on his foundation? Well, especially this guy Apollos is building on his foundation. And Apollos apparently is a very, very good speaker and smart cookie from Alexandria, according to the book of Acts. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Acts says about him. And Alexandria is a place of great, you know, philosophical learning, also within Jewish culture there. Philo of Alexandria is from there. And this guy Apollos apparently has been saying, Paul's kind of not really got it. What Christ was about was internal change and, you know, wisdom and understanding the world and how to live. He's like a guru of how to live. It's not like a dying and rising savior who's going to be coming back soon, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, like I don't know, 8 to 10 or so, he says, you know, already you've become kings. Already you're wealthy. Already you're full. You're happy. You've got all knowledge. He says sarcastically, I wish I were like you. And he rails against the debaters and the wisdom of this age. And then later in 15, he says, you know, some of you are saying there's no resurrection even of the dead, like, because you can't get your heads around the idea of resurrection, which is what that's the whole thing that I've been saying. Christ rose and you're going to rise up to heaven. So what I'm trying to say to him is, it seems to me that right from the beginning, you have at least 3 very different directions in Christ following. And that suggests to me that there's something to argue about, that actually Jesus' brother was Jesus' brother. And that's what his stake was in the whole thing.
Well,
I think I know my brother. Yeah.
Well, can I ask this? Maybe I hope I do a good job at asking this, but we're talking about it as if we know, or we're making the assumption, at least for the benefit of the doubt or the sake of argument, that these were real people. At least some of them. At least Paul was probably real. Peter was probably real. And at face value, it starts to look like, well, is there really a reason to doubt it? You know, if we're going to doubt them, we're going to doubt all kinds of people in history. But when you start to look at some of the copies that were made, the parallels, for example, when you look at Paul's story in the book of Acts, and you realize, you know, when someone like Dennis MacDonald shows you this guy is doing the exact same stuff, often in the exact same order, and sometimes with the exact same verbiage, literally like he's copying the language from the Iliad, the Odyssey, you begin to say, wait a second. I mean, it'd be kind of like if 1,000 years from now, someone's reading a textbook about Superman,
Yeah.
and we say, well, Clark Kent's mom said this, and we're acting like they're real people. Paul said this, Peter said this, and we're not stepping back and saying, wait a second, is Clark Kent's mom really real, or is that just part of this story too? And when I see Paul looking like Odysseus to a ridiculous extent, I begin to think, not necessarily that I think it's a jump to say there's no Paul, but just to say it sounds like Paul was having stories written about him, at least later when Acts was written, they kind of made it look like he was a copy or better, just like Jesus was a better version of Moses or Joshua, that, or the nation of Israel, that Paul is like a better version of Odysseus. And you begin to say, well, wait a second, how do I know which part of this is actually real? I mean, even in Second Peter, he said, I know Second Peter is considered, a forgery, but he talks to Peter, whoever writes it, says, we didn't come up with cleverly devised tales. Well, there's the implication that someone was coming up with cleverly devised tales, which is ironic that he would do that in a forgery. But we're not coming up with cleverly devised tales, but someone else is. So who is this someone else? And I know I've heard even from some people that you have to look at it symbolically in the sense of, for example, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to even speak to this even a little bit, but like, was the Qumran community, were they calling themselves the Jerusalem church? And once you start to go down certain rabbit trails, you realize, I can't think of this as, well, Paul said this. It's saying somebody said, somebody supposedly named Paul, who may or may not, who maybe that was Simon Magus. Somebody said this, and I can't take it at face value anymore. And it's kind of the whole domino thing of, once you start to say Paul was a rewrite of Odysseus, Jesus was a rewrite of a whole bunch of guys, it begins to beg the question where you kind of started with of the inerrancy of the scripture. Once you have a few chips fall and say, oh, there's some errors, well, there's some mythology. Well, how far does it go, and how do you know when to stop and say, no, this 15 or 20% was historical, and the rest of it was probably mythological, or at least it was so mythologized and euhemerized that we can't really say too much more. How do you deal with that?
You snuck in the word euhemerized as if everybody knows what it means. But anyway, maybe your regular listeners do, but nicely done. I think
feel free to define it.
No, it's okay. Let's not go there. But I think part of the problem is here. Well, quick answer. There's no given starting and ending point. Everything's up for grabs. Everything. So the question is, what historians do is to ask the question about the past. As you said, historia means investigation. That's all it means. That's what it is. It's investigating the human past. And the assumption of history is we don't know in advance what happened. If we knew, we wouldn't need to do history. History is the solving of problems in the human past. You can't do an open and honest investigation if you already know the solution. This is part of the problem I have with Christ mythicism generally. It's exactly the same problem as I have with theologians. It's not anymore an open-ended investigation. It's proof upon proof of what I already know or think I know. So, for example, when you said, well, once you see the fact that, Paul appears as an Odysseus or something like that because of Dennis MacDonald's work, well, I think that's a problematic starting point. Yes, there are, MacDonald has done this very learned and very interesting work with a number of early Christian texts. But it's not plausible in my view in its overall. He has many insightful remarks and observations, but as a program, it's not plausible, I think. What I mean by that is, if an ancient person read one of Paul's letters, for example, forget about Acts now. Acts may be as late as 120 or 130. So Acts is like way out of the picture. It's a secondary source, that is not relevant for understanding Paul, I think.
Sure.
But anyone reading Paul's letters, these are letters, and they're not essays, they are half of the conversation. And that's what lends a lot of credibility to them. That is not that we should believe what they say, but that we should believe that they're actually letters by this guy who had a coherent life. Now, how many of his letters were written by him, that's another thing. He says, or somebody says in 2 Thessalonians, talk about ironies, 2 Thessalonians says, there are letters circulating in my name that aren't by me. Don't believe them. Well, all right. What do you do with that? That's a very neat way to forge a letter. And many scholars say that it's a forgery. And there's a lot of debate about Colossians and Ephesians. There are only 7, as you know, 7 letters that are generally held to be authentic.
Right.
But that's because of their coherence. But then other scholars would add Colossians and Ephesians. Others would add at least 2 Thessalonians, so maybe 10. Hardly anybody thinks the pastorals, except sort of evangelical scholars, think that the pastoral letters are authentic because they just seem to represent a different world of thought. They're not coherent with Paul's letters. Anyhow, so it's not a matter of knowing in advance. It's not a matter of assuming. It's certainly not a matter of taking at face value. But what I would say about these like Homeric echoes and things like that in Acts. I've written a bunch of things on Acts, and I see a whole bunch of other classical echoes with respect to rhetoric. Demosthenes, there are parallels with Josephus, and I've made the argument that the author of Acts knows the work of Josephus because he's talking in Josephine language, and it's distinctively Josephine language. And Josephus was the expert on the Judea. Everybody knew that by the beginning of the 2nd century. So why wouldn't he echo Josephus on things like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, Pharisees being the most precise school? This language is characteristic of Josephus, and it turns up in Acts. So,
can I ask you a quick question on that note?
Yes.
Just interject. I've heard it said by some that Joseph of Arimathea could potentially be Josephus. Have you looked into that at all?
I've heard it. I've heard, a couple of the people who think that the Flavian dynasty wrote the New Testament and the works of Josephus. Such person sent me an entire book manuscript, and I waded through it. And, it just doesn't make any sense. For a historian of the period who's trying to make sense of these texts in their environment, it just doesn't explain anything.
Okay.
This is not a great criticism of these authors. It's just, what can I say? It doesn't help me with what I'm doing every day. So, for example, with Josephus, every day I'm translating and writing commentary on Josephus. Now, book 4 of the Jewish War. There's all kinds of. It's amazing to see the echoes of Demosthenes, of Plato, especially some interesting people like Demosthenes or Polybius and Thucydides, other historians. The way that ancient rhetoric worked was, not to be a slavish imitator. And I think that any Christ follower picking up a book like Acts and reading it would not think of Odysseus, would not think of one-for-one correspondence. We have the same problem in Josephus research. I see it as a problem. That is, when scholars write a book saying, okay, Josephus is basically doing a new Thucydides, and you have to read it as antiphonal, like a response to Thucydides. And the reader has to know, Thucydides said this, and Josephus is saying this, and he's like, in church and Anglican church, an antiphonal reading, where the priest says this and the congregation responds. It's like that's how you should read it. Another scholar said the same thing about Strabo. Josephus is actually responding to Strabo, the geographer historian. Another scholar wrote it about Seneca, who was quite close to Josephus in time, and said actually Josephus' Jewish War is a reprise of Seneca's Hercules Foren's play. that's how that's how I regard this stuff about the Flavians writing Josephus in the New Testament. It's like people have seen some stuff and matched up some things. Normal, absolutely normal to do that, but it doesn't work. You know, it doesn't work as a holistic explanation. And reading Acts as a monochromatic response to the Homeric, to the Iliad or the Odyssey, well, the Odyssey, I guess, doesn't work. You know, there's so much else going on there. There's so many other ancient writers being evoked, like in Acts 17. You know, it's got nothing to do with Homer. It's like Athens and the scavenger picking up bits and pieces. The language is very closely reminiscent of other ancient writers. And so this is the way of rhetoric in the ancient world. It's not to pin yourself to some text that you never mention, and yet the reader, this Christ follower reader, is somehow supposed to be constantly playing this three-dimensional chess game in his head and matching up with stuff from Homer. Yet it just doesn't work, I think, for me. And if you do
Even
it
for
with
the initiates?
the real problem here is if you, following through on your earlier challenge, so I've suggested there are these different directions already in the first generation. If you go to the second generation, what do you have? Gospel of Mark, so-called, you know, anonymous text, but it begins by saying, the title of it is, this is the origin of the Evangelium of Jesus Christ. That's Paul's language, right? That's distinctively Pauline language. And this author even has Jesus going around saying, the Evangelion, the announcement, Paul's announcement, will be proclaimed in all the nations, you know, before the end. Wow. I mean, so this is a Pauline Jesus here in Mark. But Matthew and Luke independently flatly disagree with Mark about pretty much everything. You know, all his distinctive ideas are crushed. Even the Evangelion that Jesus preaches is gone. In both Matthew and Luke, they erase it. Certainly John does, the fourth gospel. So there's no Jesus story. There's no harmony here. These people are vigorously disagreeing with each other. And the more that time goes on, the more they disagree. Then you get into full-blown Gnosticism in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
You know, which is really out there in some cases, with this, you know, very creative whole picture of the eons and so on in Valentinian Gnosticism. That's like eons removed from the first, you know, generation.
Well, that's actually, it's funny you say that. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. I wanted to ask you if it's possible that, and I know the word Gnosticism is kind of been recently called a misnomer for what's going on, but just to keep it for now, for sake of argument, is it possible that the Gnostic view was actually much more closely aligned with the original view? What I mean by that is, you have, you know, the Hellenistic views, the cosmology, where you've got the pure God, the idea, way up, you know, too pure to be involved with us, and then you've got the levels of heaven.
Yeah.
You've got the demigods, you've got the angels and the demons and these, and related to what you can physically see in the sky, at least in part. Well, one of the main comments or concepts they had was that, you know, that the Logos created the world, you know, Philo, and you have this existing, you know, you're talking about, you know, the Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, this idea that the archons are fighting, and Paul literally says, and you know, all this, I've got visions, you've got visions of these levels. Paul says, I was taken up to the third heaven, right there in one of the canonical books, I think, and
2 Corinthians.
And so you have this idea, and Paul literally says that Christ was killed by the archons of this age. And so to people who are already very aware of Philo, they're, you know, that's their neck deep into it, Jewish mysticism. I sometimes say those two words, mysticism, mythicism. So I'm talking about Jesus mysticism, Jewish mysticism. You know, mystics who are looking at the cosmology, they're very Hellenized, I mean, extremely Hellenized, and very aware of you know, Plato and all that. And they're coming with this worldview. They're seeing the activity in the sky, the stars, and that gets into something I want to save for a different topic, but some of them are very deep in astrotheology.
Yeah.
These stories are not, there's a face value, but when you look at them,
Yeah.
like for example, in the Old Testament, Elisha, the 42 children, the 2 bears, we're talking about Ursa Minor, Ursa Major, and this, sun versus moon with the baldness. We're talking about astrotheology very clearly, and that gets woven into the New Testament as well. But I'll save that astrotheology for another discussion. But you have these people steeped in this, and then Paul comes out and says, I had a vision. I went up to the 3rd heaven, and the archons of this age crucified our Lord and Savior. Is it possible that they had in their mind an idea of Jesus as an archangel, as a Metatron, as a guy who was crucified for his people? He was still the Savior, but he was an archangel. And at some point, somebody said, the hoi polloi are not going to understand this stuff. This is too much. Give this guy a story. You memorize this guy, put him into mythology, give him a story. Average Joe is not going to get it, that this is about astrotheology, cosmology. They're going to disbelieve it. It's going to blow them away. It's going to overwhelm them. Give it a story. Is that possible in your opinion?
Yeah, almost anything's possible,
Or probable based on the evidence?
Yeah, no, it's not probable at
Okay.
all. But I think but that sounds very dismissive, Tim. I have to rein in and explain why I say that. For me, as a historian, it's not plausible because my job is explaining evidence, and the problem that I see with this kind of schema that you've just put together as a possibility, you're not necessarily advocating it, but hypothetically, you've put it to me. It has pretty much exactly the same problem as systematic theology. It's plucking out verses from here and there and fitting them in. So the archons of this age, the 3rd heaven, and then linking it up with Valentinian Gnosticism.
Well, I was being brief about description. I mean, there's a lot more. For example, Paul never mentions a bunch of stuff about Christ.
Yeah, I get it.
Where's the virgin birth and all that?
Yeah, I get it. But the point is, if you try to understand each of his texts, in its context, like what is it about, right? And what are the movements of the people involved? I'm going to stay here in Ephesus till Pentecost, and then I hope when I come to you, I'm not going to have switching now. I hope I'm not going to have to come with a rod, but I'm sending Timothy to try to remind you. And then next text we see from him, we had a big falling out. I'm really sorry about that. All of this kind of stuff, which really dominates his writing, his early writing, isn't explained by any of that. And so what this approach would require is just abstracting a few ideas to work it into a schema. But even the bits that you were talking about, the 3rd heaven, and so on, they don't go together with that idea. So for example, in 2 Corinthians 11, what he's talking about is clearly that these other competitors of his, in this atmosphere of vigorous debate that I was talking about, have made accusations against him. And Paul's just simply trying to defend himself. That's the idea, right? Whatever anyone dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool. I have more to boast of. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? Yes, I'm talking like a madman. But hey, I've done much more than them. I've been beaten up 3 times. I've been beaten with rods. See, nobody focuses on that stuff, right? They just focus on, he goes on to say, I've been shipwrecked. I've been, suffering constantly in danger from bandits. I've been naked and cast out, all because I care for you. I got to keep on boasting, actually. I escaped from this city. I've got to keep on boasting. I know a person who went up into the 3rd heaven. I know that such a person, was caught up into paradise and heard things. So this schema is taking that line out, this mystery bit, and saying, okay, that explains the whole. And what I'm saying is, it doesn't help me that much because it is it's not explaining the text, right? That it's like systematic theology in that regard. It's just taking a concept, an abstract concept, and welding it into something that somebody thinks is nice and attractive and explanatory. But for me, it doesn't explain anything because I still have to read this text. And so in other words, what a historian does is, okay, we have two main jobs. One is interpreting what's survived, trying to understand it, and then second, explaining the historical circumstances that gave rise to it. So if we take this as what we do all the time is weigh hypotheses, right? So if you formulate this as a hypothesis, okay, is Christ mysticism hypothesis? What would that explain? Okay, well, then I try to look at each text in itself, and I think I have a pretty decent sense of what each one is about. And then I try, okay, what if this was going, well, it doesn't help me. It doesn't explain First Thessalonians, for example, about how Paul was just there and established this group, and they've sent him letters back asking, when is Christ returning? Yeah, it doesn't help. When he says, you're suffering the same abuse from your compatriots there in Thessalonica that we all suffered from the Judeans who kicked us out. None of that is explained.
Sure.
So there's just too much remainder. That's the problem.
Yeah, I would like to come back to that at some point. I think I will take it as one of my to-do lists is to get a little bit better educated. There's actually a book coming out, I think even this coming month, by Dr. Richard Carrier that does in fact defend that thesis, and I try to represent it accurately the way he would. But that version of it, of the story, I will get educated on it. I'd love to bring that up again, down the line and just see if it's something that's got more weight to it than than it seems. But I do want to.
Can I clarify? Can I clarify one point there?
Please.
Just before we finish that, I am not saying I know everything that happened and this is wrong. What I'm actually trying to say is it could be, but it doesn't help me explain the evidence. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying. And there are a lot of parts of the epistles, especially, that have very little to do with angelology or cosmology and so on.
Yeah.
It's funny. Just a very quick side note. And I want to get to the last question. You mentioned that that there's a lot of people fighting, and that Bart Ehrman's done a good job of talking about there's a lot of Christianities, and I think it's fascinating how it seems like even in some of the texts that there were interpolations where you have someone, maybe it was Paul first saying, if you want to eat meat sacrificed to idols, no, who cares? There's no real other God, so why does it matter? You're not really doing anything bad. And then you get a chapter or two later, someone's like, that's horrible, don't do that, you're dealing with demons. And it's like, what are you, a split personality here? It can't be both. And the whole idea of, I've got these women who are with me in ministry and they're so active and vital. And then it's like, hey, I don't want the women to talk in church, ask their husbands when you get, but keep silent. And it's like, you get the sense that there's almost arguments even within the texts. Yeah. Like there's people that took whatever was original and maybe eventually what happened was, scribes said, we don't really know which one was added later. So we're just going to keep it all and make it look like one. But at some point, before the scribes just started saying, okay, let's just call this canon and go with it. At some point, they were allowed to argue a little bit with it and make some kind of insertion. And it's amazing to see it, and how the Christian perspective is always, we can harmonize it. And it's like, apart from the just the pure, the stuff you'd study and where you're trying to just learn all the Greek and Latin and study, I feel like I want to tell people, step back and just take a look at the big picture. Maybe you're wrong. And that's such a hard thing. And I don't want to get into the psychology in this one because of time. I want to end with Josephus, but maybe for some point to talk about the psychology of saying, I just cannot admit that there might be a different way to explain reality or the Bible or the issues. And it honestly feels like I'm partly going down this path if I want to understand the origins of Christianity, which is in large part I want to know. I want to know what you know, because you've got so much that is exactly where I'm going with my education. But I feel like there's this other track of like, it doesn't matter. I could have the best understanding of the origins of Christianity, and someone could look at me and say, I'm not giving you 30 seconds of my time because you don't believe in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Garbage. You're deluded. You're doing the devil's work. And that fascinates me, that, and I get it, because I don't think I was like that exactly, but I was in it enough to relate to that very strongly. And there is no room for, like, it's, even if you said something like, I remember telling someone at one point, maybe 2 years ago, I said, I am more committed to studying or learning the truth than to the Bible. Now, if they align, that's great, but I'm more committed to the truth than the scriptures. And I'll tell you, that was bad news bears. That was anathema. I was like, what? How can that be different? You can't pursue the truth in not scriptures.
No, I hear you. I hear you. When we were in Bible college, I remember being very arrogant. Even when I was in high school, actually, I look at my high school graduation yearbook, you know, and I'd said things like to people, well, you know, I hope you don't rest until you find salvation in Christ, something like that. And when I read back years later, comments in my yearbook from other people, they said, well, you know, basically something very rude, but I hope you don't rest till, you know, you find the truth, something like that. In Bible college, we invited some guys from the philosophy department of the local university over to have a debate one evening. We were so arrogant that we'd read Josh McDowell. I mean, what more was there about, you know, like, we knew the truth. You couldn't argue against truth. And these guys came over and they were totally bemused, you know, by us. But we really didn't get it. We still thought we got the best of them. And I'm sure they went home thinking, what a bunch of lunatics.
It's amazing.
But you're right that those two worlds, there's nothing to talk about between them. You don't have a common foundation.
That was almost
good. Go ahead.
That was almost a secondary part of my deconversion, was the shock of realizing that of like there was the issues, the discrepancies, the moral issues, the genocide, and all that. There was the issues of the mythology, but it was also the issue of, why didn't this affect me before? Like, what? And that goes into the brainwashing issue of, this is disturbing me. Like, I know I've read the stories about genocide before, and I know there's explanations beyond explanations of what happened. It wasn't so bad. It wasn't what you thought. But like, the text just says, go in and slaughter everybody and take the young girls for yourself. Any way you take it, that doesn't sound very good. And I'm like, why didn't that bother me? And that's a whole secondary issue from what the text says. It's like, I've been brainwashed. And that was disturbing. I found that very disturbing. Of course, many people can say that was part of the ancient past. It's not, of course, not what you would do today. Both in Judaism, you know, rabbinic Judaism just moved far beyond all of that because it's part of the Hebrew Bible as well, not just the Christian Bible. But yeah, anyway, sorry, you're gonna say. I was just gonna say, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't focus on your main focus, which is Josephus. People love him. People get frustrated by his part in this story. I admit I know enough to know that I don't know enough about him. My level of knowledge is more dangerous than anything. But just maybe to end it out with maybe 5 or 7 more minutes of saying, who was Josephus? What was his relationship to the origins of Christianity? And maybe in terms of context, who were his patrons? Who was he writing for? What were his motivations? Just anything in a nutshell to someone. And we'll dive certainly deeper into him in a future visit. But just for anyone that doesn't really know, Josephus who? What are we talking about there?
I would like to know more about Josephus. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. You know, he wrote 30 volumes, which have survived. So unlike Polybius, Tacitus, Livy, these great historians who we have only in fragments, in Josephus' case, we have actually 30 complete volumes. Well, more or less, I mean, with the occasional lacuna in the text, but more or less. So that's amazing. Who was he? He was born in, we know when he was born because he double dates his birth to 37 CE. the first year of Gaius Caligula's reign as emperor. He didn't tell us when he died, unfortunately, because he couldn't. Unlike Deuteronomy, which tells you when Moses died.
Yep.
So he didn't. But we have conflicting evidence, and there are two schools of thought. He either died around well into the early 2nd century, or around 100, something like that. It depends on the date of his writing. So his first work. So here's his story. Basically, he's a priest, aristocrat from Jerusalem. Being a priest, at least of the wealthier level of priests, there are 2 or 3 levels among them, and he belongs to the middle upper level of the priests. Apparently, he's got very good connections in the upper priesthood. And the priests are a caste. They are not like Greco-Roman priests, where you can become a priest. You're born into the priesthood in Jewish tradition, in the Bible's law. And so he's a priest from a priestly family. That makes him an aristocrat. He's a very good education, apparently with Greek included, but speaking Hebrew and Aramaic. And he knows the Bible reasonably well because he writes a detailed account of it in his Antiquities. Anyway, when he's engaged in diplomatic services, he already at age 26 is sent off to Rome to try to get the release from Nero's court of some other priests who have been imprisoned there. And he says it's with the help of Nero's nice wife, who steps in for him. And that's quite fascinating, that she seems to take a shine to him in some way, more than Nero does. We don't know how Nero was involved. Anyway, he got the people released, so that's pretty nice. And this is the wife Poppaea, who helps him. So he comes back, and this all takes a couple of years for him to go out and come back. And when he comes back, he says he finds Jerusalem in a state of turmoil, and the seeds of the revolt are beginning against Rome. And so he says that he didn't want the revolt. He tried to calm everything down. Nevertheless, he gets posted up to Jerusalem, up to Galilee, pardon me, to oversee. He gives 2 conflicting accounts. In one case, he says, I was sent there to raise an army, and he presents himself as a great general. In the other account, he says, I was sent there to calm things down and get people to lay down their arms and wait and see what the Romans would do. Anyway, the long and short, to make a long story short, he is overrun by the Romans at a town called Jotapata, and surrenders to them. I think he had no choice. The only other choice was suicide. That's what he says his companions chose. For some reason, this is often presented as if he's a turncoat. He went over to the Romans. Well, he surrendered to them. He was kept in captivity for a couple of years, then freed. He made a famous prediction, allegedly, and this prediction was that Vespasian would become emperor and his son Titus after him. It's not easy, it's not difficult to figure out that this could have been an agreed concoction between them, that he's this oriental, mysterious guy who offers a prediction which would help the new regime in power and say, you know, this guy from the East said that we've been predicted in his sacred text. So you know, something like that may have been worked out. Who knows? We don't know. But anyway, he spends the bulk of his life in Rome after that. He goes there only aged early 30s, and then he spends the rest of his life there. But he writes about his people. He writes about the Judean War in 7 volumes, arguing against those who simply flatter the Romans and humiliate the Jews, as saying it was a walkover, piece of cake. No, he says, my people actually gave the Romans a run for their money. They're very tough. They're contemptuous of death. Then a few years later, 15, 20 years later, he writes the Antiquities in 20 volumes, the Judean Antiquities, all the way from creation until the eve of the war. And it repeats much of the material in the first book, The War, in its later volumes. But he tells the story quite differently, which is fascinating. Then he has a 1-volume autobiography which is not really an autobiography, but a little bit about focusing on his time in Galilee. And then finally, a 2-volume essay. It's not a narrative anymore, but an essay on the antiquity of the Judeans. So picking up the theme of antiquities itself, that his people go right back to creation, and now arguing against Greco-Roman authors who humiliate and diminish the Judeans. So most of his work is really about defending his people and finding a place for them.
Did you have any sense that he had anything to do directly with the New Testament in terms of not people borrowing, but him actually influencing it?
No. Well, him influencing it in the sense that I do think it most likely, I can't prove it, but I think it most likely that the author of Luke Acts knew the work of Josephus, among other.
But it wasn't like he went out. It wasn't like we have evidence that he tried to do that. It's just he was passive in that. Okay.
I don't think he knew. He has 3 passages of specific relevance to Christ followers. One is on John the Baptist, one is on Jesus' brother James, and one is on Jesus himself. And they're very short. And these have been, Carrier wrote an article arguing, for example, that the James passage is a Christian interpolation.
I was going to ask you about the one about Jesus, I believe it's called the Testimonium Flavianum.
Yeah, that's the traditional name for it, yeah. What
is that, and what does Eusebius have to do with that?
Well, that's a much debate. You know, there was a guy who wrote a book in 1863 and said, you know, this passage has been so endlessly debated, there's nothing more to be said about it. And then he tried to say something more anyway. And that is exactly what's happened for the next 170 years or so. People just keep saying, this passage has been discussed to death, but here's the truth. So I think we can forget about that. The passage is simply that Josephus is talking about Pontius Pilate, as the kind of equestrian governor in the south of Judea, southern Syria, Judea. And he's talking about various things that Pilate did. And then he just bursts in and says, about this time there was a man named Jesus, if you can call him a man. He was an amazing guy, he did wondrous works, and his followers thought that he was raised on the 3rd day, and this is a fulfilled prophecy and things like that. And there's a little line in there that just says, he was the Christos, he was the Christ. Well, that's weird. So pretty much everybody thinks that at least that line is if not a complete fabrication, maybe it drops out a word like he was believed to be the Christ or something like that. But anyway, it's been fiddled with in the transmission of the text, remembering that these were all copied by Christians. It was Christians who liked the work of Josephus and copied it. So Eusebius, what's he got to do with it? Well, a couple of phrases in particular in that passage look very much like distinctive phrases in Eusebius. So one scholar has argued that it's a fabrication from Eusebius.
Eusebius is much later, correct?
Yeah, he's writing the early 4th century.
Okay.
So he's writing 200 and some years later.
I've heard it said, I forget which church father would have said this, but wasn't there something where they were aware of Josephus and loved his work, that it was there, but that they questioned, why isn't he saying anything about Jesus? Is that correct to say?
Yeah. That's commonly said. That's Alice Whaley says that in her book on the Testimony Flavianum, for example. It's quite odd. Well, it's not that they don't say anything about it. It's not exactly that. There are 2 different issues here. Yeah. Yes, there is an argument. What if that passage was there and known to be there? These Christian authors who do use Josephus, Acts is my argument, but not everyone agrees with that. But other Christian authors definitely use him, from Theophilus of Antioch onward, Clement of Alexandria. These guys Origen know and use him. Why don't they make more of the Jesus passage? Well, it depends what he wrote about Jesus. That's the problem. So pretty much everyone agrees that statement, he was the Christ, if it had been there in the original, would have been cited. They would have said, even this guy said he was the Messiah. So that's a pretty good argument for that line not being there. But one kind of approach to it is to say what he originally wrote was not as Christianized as the version we have, and maybe even was a little bit critical of this guy.
I've heard it doesn't fit the context either, right? Like he's talking about Pilate and the bad stuff, massacres, and then by the way, there's this awesome guy Christ, and now let's go back to the massacres. And is it true to say? I'm sorry.
Josephus does that a lot, though.
Okay.
And so does Paul. You mentioned the thing about idol meat in 1 Corinthians 8-10, and with he stops out in chapter 9 as a kind of, it's like an ABA pattern.
Right.
Josephus does that all the time. That's a pattern of his writing, that he'll introduce a topic, then he'll step away from it, and then he'll return to it.
Okay.
So some scholars say, well, you could remove this passage and the thing would just tie up very neatly, and that proves that it's an interpolation. Well, no, because that's how he writes.
Okay.
You could get rid of much of his work by doing that.
Would it be hard though for a non-Christian Jewish person, especially of that day, to have said such nice things about Jesus? In the sense of would a Jew just say that, or is that part of the question of what did he originally say?
Yeah, it's part of that question, I think. My own view is it doesn't matter that much. I don't really care. The passage is not very significant for understanding Josephus.
Yeah.
It's of great fascination to Christians, of course, for understandable reasons. But for understanding Josephus, it's one paragraph in book 18 of a 20-volume work that, it's irrelevant. He says lots of irrelevant things. I mean, he'll make notes. He has detours on all kinds of stuff because that's how he writes history. He wants to keep you entertained. Dionysius of Halicarnassus and many others, even the geographers like Pliny, the elder, they're doing that. They explicitly say, you can't just keep droning on. You have to break up the narrative with interesting tidbits everywhere. So
that's interesting.
I think, we need to get rid of this modern mentality. We don't need to get rid of it, but we need to understand the ancient kind of principles of rhetoric.
Yeah, the reason I would say it's fascinating, and I'll wrap up here in a second, but I'm fascinated by just the concept from a Christian apologetics perspective of there's all this evidence for Jesus, and I've heard from, I don't know if you're familiar with David Fitzgerald's work and obviously Richard Carrier, but the idea that there was a bunch of Roman historians who were very good, and they did a great job cataloging endless stuff, including the apocalyptic messianic preachers, and yet all the people that you'd expect to say something about him, they don't say anything. And the few people that supposedly say something, they've all been, I don't know if you want to use the word debunked per se, but just they've been pulled apart, deconstructed in a way that says this one was about a different Jesus. This one looks like it was added, a couple hundred years later. And when you pull it apart, you end up with this question of, okay, at best, it looks really shady. At worst, it looks like there is literally not a single historian who, knowing that this man fed the 4,000, fed the 5,000, he turned the world upside down. And, the one gospel writer says he did so much that all the books in the world couldn't contain what he's done. He's God's son. He's everything. But nobody notices. Even at his death, there's an earthquake. There's dead people coming out of graves. It's like nobody notices this stuff. And I find it fascinating, stepping away from Josephus, just a Christian apologetics perspective of saying Christians need to know this stuff. And that was one of my biggest beefs with my Christian education, was just regardless of where you land, if you want to study all this stuff and then still call yourself a Christian, whatever that means to you, but at least be honest with the facts. Say, look, the historical proof of Jesus isn't good at all. It looks like there's not much to go on. Is that fair to say?
I don't think so. I think,
okay.
I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, I do, only because I know time is short. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. History is about explaining evidence, and the main evidence we have is from the earliest evidence we have is Paul's letters, and you have to explain those. So how did all this disagreement come about over this really vigorous, I mean, condemnation? You're going to hell, anathema to you. You're a son of Satan for holding the views you do. Where did this kind of vigorous debate about this man come from if the man didn't live, if he never existed? It's one thing if somebody sits down and says, right, I have a blank canvas here, I'm going to craft a nice mythological story. And from what I hear sometimes I haven't investigated very deeply the Christ mythicist angle, but I've read a few things. And from what I read, it's at that level of abstraction. This is concocted maybe on the basis of Egyptian stuff and other things floating around. But actually, it's not. I mean, the first texts we read are letters in which it's not deliberately saying anything about this, but we can see in the background that there's this huge debate going on about who Jesus was. How do you explain that? The simplest explanation, I'm not saying it's the only one, but
Sure.
I prefer the most economical explanations with the fewest moving parts and the fewest number of assumptions. Simplest explanation is there's a guy, Jesus, and his brother is one of the people naturally trying to preserve it. When somebody famous dies today, I've lost some friends and associates in the past couple of years, and I've noticed that there's often a fight about their legacy. This person says, I was really close to them. I heard that the guy told me what he wanted to do with his library. No, he did not. He told me something else. This kind of, this is absolutely normal in human affairs. And so when I read Paul's letters, what I see is a very normal debate. One guy's saying, hey, I'm the guy's brother, for heaven's sake. I know what he was. Other people say, yeah, but we lived with him. He was students. And you, Paul, you claim to know him, and you never met him. And Paul's saying, yeah, but I talked to him this morning from, the spirit of him. So, well, come on, so these debates that we actually see there, it seems to me, are precisely the kind of thing that would take place if people are fighting over his legacy.
Well, two questions then. Who do you think he was, if he was real? I mean, was he a messianic preacher? Was he a magician? Was he, was he a Pharisee, an Essene? Who was he most likely? And then, secondarily, just to go back to the original question, why do the historians not notice him? Why is he so barren on that level?
Take second question first. I don't think that most of the histories. I don't know why we should put such stock in the histories. I mean, Tacitus writing in the early 2nd century. He's talking about Rome, basically, and the difficulties in Rome. And he does talk about the execution of this guy, Jesus, in relation to the Romans, to the Roman Christians, right? That, in other words, their belief about it. So yeah, he's only getting this from what they say about him. That's true, but why would he have a motive to do anything else? I mean, there are tons of people mentioned in Josephus who are significant people, like John of Giscala and Simon Bar-Giora, who get a brief mention only because they appeared in Rome at the triumph, and people know about them as the two major figures of the war. But then a whole bunch of others who were involved, like the high priests at the time, who were major figures, towering figures in Judea, who are never mentioned by anybody. Why would they? The question is, why would they be? This is the historian's challenge, is to explain evidence, right? And so to say that, well, this doesn't appear here, why would it appear there?
Weren't there historians that mention the other messianic preachers? I guess that I'm not. I do this argument from silence, but if they talk about, well, there was this big event, there was that big event, there are these preachers that got slaughtered by the Romans in the desert.
Not really. The main one is Josephus. He's the guy who tells us, and he says there were tons of them. And I'm going to mention a couple of them.
Sure.
So where were the tons of them? They're not mentioned by anybody. We don't know who they were. We only know the ones he mentions.
Okay.
and he has his reason for mentioning them, right? So yeah, that's it. There's no reason for Cassius Dio, and we have to remember that all of these authors are fragmentary anyway. Cassius Dio we have only in the Byzantine epitomes. Tacitus has his own reasons for writing, which he lays out pretty clearly, and his scope is quite limited. Suetonius, it's the lives of the Caesars. That's what he's talking about. So I mean, Livy was too early. What historians are we actually saying should have mentioned Jesus?
I guess
there aren't any, except Josephus, and he does.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm being a little bit devil's advocate for the Christian side, just in the sense of, and the Jesus mythicist side, just saying, if Jesus mythicists say that the likelihood is there wasn't a guy, it was all mythologized. It was probably a guy from, an angel, an archangel in Jewish mysticism, which got euhemerized, mythologized, and there we have it. But like, if you just gave, if we could just find one example, someone else has said this is my description, but if we could just find one Roman centurion that says, I was walking through a town in Israel and I saw this amazing preacher and he had this great sermon. It was kind of about this and that. And he writes it home to his wife. And for somehow we have it's saved. Just one little letter that says, I saw a man named Jesus who was a messianic preacher. We don't have even one of those, which, I mean, I think there's got to be a fairness of saying, if there's not one single evidence, really good evidence, that's not an interpolation, it's just crystal clear, somebody that has no vested interest says, I saw Jesus. If the answer to that is, it seems like the answer might be zero. There might be zero people doing that. I think it does at least leave the door open to Jesus mythicism to say that sounds kind of,
the doors
sounds
open,
kind of weird.
The door's open to, aliens landing in Judea. That in itself is irrelevant. The question for a historian is, what evidence would we expect? Who would write about this stuff? The one who would write about it is Josephus, because he's talking about affairs in Judea. And Josephus doesn't even mention who all the governors were, right? Not even who all the governors were. We're not entirely clear about the line of the high priest, and these are the major leaders of the time. The point is, these are not data sources. Historians are not video reporters. They have their own interests, their own reasons for writing. Josephus is the only one who would presumably have a motive, if anyone, to mention Jesus, and he does. So what's the problem?
Does it imply that he didn't do much? Like, if there was a guy at the beginning that he didn't
if you talk about centurions, for example, this is also a misnomer. We see from films that the place is occupied by Roman legions, but it wasn't. Roman legions were 3 weeks march away up on the closer to the Euphrates River. There are 4 legions, but they're based in northern Syria. So there are a couple of centurions around, but these guys are on secondment to the auxiliary forces. So it's not like there are only maybe 3,000 of them in the entire southern region. So it's not like there are these literate Romans wandering around Judea, writing sketchbooks or notebooks or something like that. Right. I think one thing that's really stunning, Tim, to realize is that how much we don't know about the past. That's the beginning of history, right? Is to say we know almost nothing actually in relation to life as it was lived once. All that happened, we know almost nothing of that. We have only a few slivers, and to lean on those people who provide those few slivers and say, why didn't you tell us everything we want to know now because of our curiosity? I think it's not fair exactly.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that'd be a great point to end on, is just that there is a lot of unknowns here. And on that note, though, I would like to say, just in terms of putting a pin in a note for a future discussion, on the evidence that we do have, I would love to pick your brain sometime about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library. I know that there's a whole bunch of questions we could go into there. And I'd also love to go into what we know about early Christianity from the apocryphal books. It feels like there's so much more to this, because often a lot of the discussions are about what did Paul say, what did the gospel writers say, and it's like, but but which gospels? There's like 45 of them or something. You know, which gospels are you talking about? Okay, well, we're only talking about 4. All right, well,
Yeah.
but why are we limiting the discussion to those? And I know that there's probably a lot of insights you could provide with those. So I'd love to dive into the little evidence we have. I'd love to dive into what you do know of those evidences, and I'm sure
Yeah.
there's endless discussions we could go on those. But
Yeah, sure.
well, thank you so
Hey,
much.
it's
Awesome.
it's been absolute delight for me. I really it's been great to meet you, Tim. And
Likewise.
yeah, I've enjoyed the conversation enormously. You're a very generous host, I must say. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You've been more than generous with your time, and I know we started with your bio, and you're obviously a very, very busy person. So I appreciate you being willing to take the time and share some of your expertise with us. And I really do look forward to doing it again. And I just appreciate all the nuances that you bring into this, because we've all got blinders, whether you're evangelical Christian, or you're an atheist, or you're a Jesus mythicist or historicist. We've all got blinders on, and we need people to say, take a second look. There's more to this story, and I appreciate that you do that in a very, very easy way. And I hope that our viewers can say, yeah, there's some more to look into here. So, and I do again look forward to diving into your works. I'm going to try to get a copy of some of your Josephus books and the other books, and hopefully get better educated with your work.
Thank you, Tim. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you again. We'll do it again soon.
Okay, thank you.